Good afternoon. It's great to see everybody. We'll give it another minute or two, let everybody get in, and then we'll start our program. Great to see some familiar names. Glad to have you back with us. So we're starting our spring Lunch and Learn series. Going to give it maybe one more minute and then we'll get started. Hope everybody's doing well. Yeah, good Monday morning. I guess we're at afternoon now. Okay, I think we'll get started. Welcome all of you to our first spring Lunch and Learn series. We're really excited today to hear from Anthony Edwards, the Colorado Communications Liaison for the Bonita Peak Mining District, and Peter Butler, Chair of the Bonita Peak Mining District Community Advisory Group. They're going to give us an update today. That's a mouthful. They're going to give us an update today about what's going on in the Bonita Peak mining area. And so I'll turn it over to Anthony and Peter. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Christine.
Thanks, Christine.
I'm going to kind of go through a PowerPoint. Actually, both of us are. To kind of just give you a general update of some of the things that are going on up at Bonita Peak. So let me pull that up, make sure I can share this. Let's see here. No, that doesn't look right.
Peter, I can see it.
Oh, you can?
Yeah.
For some reason, I'm not seeing the presentation. Let me look real quick here.
Okay.
Oh, it popped up on my, I've got two monitors here and it popped up on the other monitor.
Got it.
So I'll just move forward with that then. Well, thanks everyone for sharing lunch with us. This is the update on the Bonita Peak Mining District, the Superfund site. And I'll just jump right in here. So some of the current activities up in Superfund site, there's some number of activity around Gladstone. There's a repository design at the Mayflower Tailings Impoundment number 4. There's a number of site stabilization projects, IROD projects, and IROD is the interim record of decision. This was an interim record of decision that was signed off on, I think, is 2019. There's also investigation of fluvial tails around and above Howardsville. And then the bottom two are actually the two that we're going to spend a fair amount of time with, because these are the two things that are going on right now. One is proposed water quality standards in Upper Mineral Creek. This is a water quality standards proposal from the CAG. And then the other thing that's going on is the settlements. There's actually two settlements. I've just got one down here. The big one, the United States and Sunnyside Gold Corp, and that's what Anthony's going to talk about. So I'm going to kind of go through the first four fairly quickly. I'm actually not even going to talk about the investigation of the fluvial tailings, because I don't know very little about it, or I know very little about it. EPA is going to give us a presentation on this in the coming months, and we'll learn quite a bit more. But I just noted it up there because this is kind of one of the projects in one of the areas that's going on, but I don't know much about it. So I'm going to start off talking a little bit about the area on Gladstone. And I kind of apologize. This is an old map. EPA actually has some newer, nicer looking ones that have a little more information on it, but I couldn't seem to find one quickly over the past couple of days. So I pulled up this old one. And this is the area. Gladstone is way down on the lower left-hand corner of that map. The middle of that diagram, where you can see all kinds of mine tunnels, kind of a spaghetti dish there, that's the Sunnyside mine. And Lake Emma was sitting right on top of that. For those of you who don't know, Lake Emma was a pretty large alpine lake that actually crashed down through the mine in 1978, dropped about 2,000 vertical feet through the mine workings and came out the American Tunnel, which is that purple line that goes off from the center of the page down to the lower left. Some other things to point out in there, the kind of a little smaller spaghetti web over to the lower left-hand side, that's the Gold King mine and the Gold King mine workings. The red and bonita is actually, you got to look pretty closely to spot it. It's the small little red mine just up above Gladstone there on the lower left-hand side. And then the Mogul mine is on the upper left-hand side. So the four big mines here, or the four big mine discharges, I should say, are the Red and Bonita, the Gold King, the American Tunnel, which is that purple line that pops out there at Gladstone, and the Mogul mine. And let me actually put up another diagram here so you can see, get a little bit of a sense of kind of elevation of these different mines as well. So you can see that the American Tunnel goes well underneath the Gold King. They're not connected. Initially, the American Tunnel was part of the Gold King mine. It was the owners of the Gold King in the 1920s drove the American Tunnel to get up and underneath the Gold King mine to give better access into drainage. But then they ran out of money and never connected the mine to the American Tunnel. Then the American Tunnel was pushed back farther in the late 1950s, early 1960s by Standard Metals to get underneath the Sunnyside mine, and became the main access to the Sunnyside mine. And there they mined using the American Tunnel for about 30 years. So the four big, you can kind of see them right out there in the lower left-hand picture. The Mogul, the Gold King, the Red and Bonita, and the American Tunnel are really the largest sources of metal loading, mining-related metal loading up in the upper Animas Basin. A number of years ago, when the Animas River Stakeholders Group sampled probably about 125 mines or so, draining mines, we eventually found that these four mines contributed about as much metal as the other 121 mines combined. So they're much larger sources than most of the other mines in the basin. And that's why there should be a lot of effort in looking at what to do with these particular mines. So what's going on up in Gladstone now? Right now, there's continued treatment of the Gold King mine drainage. That's been ongoing since the fall of 2015. That treatment plant was meant to be an interim treatment plant. It was put up very quickly by contractors. EPA gave them a very tight timeline. It was not made to be a long-term solution. If a treatment plant ends up being there in the long term, it'll have to be redesigned and made much more efficient. The Red Bonita has had some work done on it. A bulkhead was installed in 2015. It was installed right around the time of the Gold King spill. But there's a valve in the bulkhead to release the water, and the valve had not ever been shut until 2020. When EPA did a test on it to back up the water and see how well it was holding the pressure. They tested it for about 4 months or so, where they shut the valve, backed up the water, and then slowly released the water before winter came, and all that water that was in behind the bulkhead was treated at this the Gold King treatment plant. So they got a sense of how well it would hold pressure, although it wasn't fully pressurized, and also did quite a bit of effort in sampling seeps and springs and seeing if water was coming out other places. There are very small amounts of water that came out in some other what looked to be historical springs, but not a great deal. So I think generally that was a pretty successful test. Unfortunately, it probably won't be shut for good for quite a few years. Some other activities that are going on up in Gladstone, in the Gladstone area, is that EPA is planning on putting some wells into the mine pool. I think they up at Lake Emma. Nobody knows how deep the mine pool is in the Sunnyside mine. The last time the elevation was measured in the Sunnyside mine was about 2000, the end of 2002, before some lower bulkheads were put in. Back up for a second there. So the first bulkhead was put in close to the spaghetti jam, kind of above where it says Bonita Peak. There's an X. That was the first bulkhead that was put in 96. It backed up the water about 1,200 vertical feet in the mine workings. And that was the point where pressure was measured, so we knew how deep, or people knew how deep the water was in the mine pool. These lower bulkheads put down in the lower left-hand corner near Gladstone, those two lower ones were put in at kind of the end of 2002, 2003. And once those were put in, there was no access to that upper bulkhead. And so nobody's known what the elevation of that mine pool is since that time. So the idea is to drill some wells into the mine pool from Lake Emma. EPA was hoping to do that this year, but as far as I know, I think that's not going to happen for about another year. The other major activity that will be going on is that EPA has decided to put a new 1,300-foot tunnel into the Gold King mine workings. They're concerned that the current tunnel is not that stable, and it won't be that stable over the long term. They've drilled a borehole kind of alongside the current tunnel, and that'll be, I think, the approximate path of this new tunnel to drive in there. And that's going to take quite a bit of time and effort. And I'm not sure if they're going to try to initiate that in 2023 or not yet. So those are some of the main activities in Gladstone. And like I said before, this is where you're really going to see big gains and big changes in water quality, is what you can do at these particular mines in this area. Another activity that's going on at EPA's been undertaking is a design of a site-wide repository. And this would be on top of the tailings pond number 4. On the right-hand side there, you can see an aerial view of the tailings pond. So this was a tailings pond that was reclaimed then by Sunnyside Gold. Sunnyside still owns it. That's one of the few large flat spaces that's available in San Juan County. I think that whole flat space up there is about 35 acres, and EPA's plan is to build a permanent repository there. One of the main materials that's going to go into that repository is the sludge from the treatment plant up at Gladstone. The first 2 years of sludge were mixed with mine tailings up at the Kitty Mac site, and so that was kind of that's supposed to be an interim repository, kind of farther up the valley above the Mayflower tailings pond. But since the past 3 or 4 years, all the sludge has been stored on site. And so this will give EPA a place to put that sludge and then put other materials from other sites. And construction, that's kind of been pushed back a couple times. We kind of thought construction was going to happen maybe the end of last year, and then it got pushed back to this year, and now it looks like it's pushed back to 2023. Fortunately, the Gold King isn't discharging nearly as much water as was initially. The water levels have gone down quite a bit. Right after the spill, it was generating as much as 700 gallons per minute. I think it's down around 200, 250 in that range. And so it's not generating nearly as much sludge, so they're not accumulating as much sludge there at the treatment plant in a temporary storage. There's also stabilization projects going on at a number of different sites. And those entail things like moving mine drainage off the mine waste. This is one of those projects of the Anglo-Saxon, which is up Cement Creek. Also, they're looking to remove sludge out of ponds right below. They're capturing this drainage to kind of make sure they have capacity and don't overflow very easily if they get a big discharge. And pulling mine waste out of the streams. So these were projects that EPA designated. I kind of think of them as kind of maintenance type projects. I don't think they make very much difference in terms of water quality, but they're probably the things that ought to be done. And these are all ongoing. A number of them have been done this past couple of years, and they're going to be doing some more this year. So that's kind of the main on the ground work that they're going to be working on. So this is kind of one of the areas that I did want to spend a little time talking about. There's been a number of water quality changes in Upper Mineral Creek over the past 25 years. There were a number of mine remediation projects that were done. This is before the Superfund designation. Most of them were done by the Animas River Stakeholders Group. Some were done by some mining companies. Forest Service did a project up there, and they've made a large difference. In the mid-1990s, the water quality was too toxic in the Upper Mineral Creek to support any aquatic life. And so when there was a big standards proposal in 2001, no aquatic life classification was put upon the upper part of Mineral Creek above South Fork of Mineral Creek. One of the projects that really made a big difference was the bulkhead put in the Kohler Tunnel. Kohler Tunnel's almost right there at the top of Red Mountain Pass. It's off on the east side, maybe about 300 yards or so off the highway. This particular tunnel discharged an enormous amount of metals, probably more metals than the Gold King does, more metals than the Red Bonita does. Before the bulkhead was put in, it was discharging about 78 pounds of zinc per day, which is an enormous amount. There's no other mines that are that close to that. The bulkhead was put in 2020 or 2002 and 2003. 2003. And then there was some leakage on the outside in the mine tunnel downstream of the bulkhead. And the Animas Stakeholders Group came in like 2011 and pressure grouted that area. Kind of used a company that does pressure grouting for dams. Abutments of dams, and they came in and drilled holes and pressure grouted all around it, which helped seal it out further. And the Kohler now only releases about 3 pounds of zinc per day, down from 78 pounds per day. So that's a huge win, and that's made a huge difference in the water quality downstream. We have not seen seeps and springs sprout up and have that water diverted into a lot of other locations, which is real fortunate. This is a case where a bulkhead seems to have worked quite well. The pressure behind that bulkhead, I think the water is maybe 120 feet deep, something along those lines, looking at the pressure gauge. So that dramatically improved Mineral Creek. And then there were a number of other mine waste projects that were done there as well. So looking at data at Burrow Bridge, which is downstream from a lot of these mine remediation site projects. Burrow Bridge is where the Ophir Pass Road crosses Mineral Creek, and then it heads up the middle fork of Mineral Creek and goes up and over towards Ophir. Anyways, at Burrow Bridge, the data shows it's been about a 95% reduction in copper and about a 70% reduction in cadmium and zinc since the mid-1990s, since all these projects were done. So this is an area, like I said, where there's been a lot of success. A lot of these projects were funded by 319. And then, much to everyone's surprise, brook trout were found in this upper part of Mineral Creek in 2016. And they've been seen there in other surveys as well. And macroinvertebrates show a pretty healthy population there too. And overall, we did an analysis, and all water quality parameters meet aquatic life table value standards, except for cadmium, copper, lead, and zinc during spring runoff. And then the rest of the year, cadmium, copper, and lead do meet table value standards. Zinc doesn't meet table value standards year round. So the segment that we're talking about is the number 4 up there. This is a map of EPA's priority reaches, reaches where they want to improve water quality. All these reaches have fisheries in them. Segment 4 is the only segment of these 4 that currently does not have an aquatic life use classification, nor does it have standards that would be protective of an aquatic life use. And so that's something that the CAG wants to rectify. All those little blue X's, or I'm sorry, yellow X's that you see on the rest of that diagram, those are all those are the 48 mine sites that are designated under the Bonita Peak Superfund site. So this gives you a sense of how much things have changed at Burrow Bridge in that segment 4. The data, you can see there's a few samples that were taken in the early 1990s by the Water Quality Control Division, and this is the 85th percentile of those samples. And you can see what the current standard is. The current standard is kind of off the graph on on 2 of those diagrams. The current standard is designed to protect agricultural uses in this area. And there's some sheep grazing up there. That's why the agricultural use. And you can see that standard is very, very high. The chronic TVS, table value standard, is what's designed to protect sensitive species of aquatic life. And you can see that there's been huge improvements in zinc, cadmium, and copper over time. And in recent years, we're getting pretty close to that chronic table value standards. So the CAG's proposal, let me go another step here. A little bit more analysis of what's going on in this segment. Looking at 47 sample points in this segment, this is the way that the Water Quality Control Division looks for whether or not a use is attained or standards are being attained. Is they look at paired exceedances. You look at your water quality sample. You look at the hardness, because the standards are based on hardness-based equations. You plug in the hardness for that sample, and then you see if that sample meets the standard or not. And you count up how many of those samples meet the standard and how many samples don't. So you're looking at an 85th percentile of exceedances. And so with 87 samples, that means you could have 7 exceedances over that 5-year time period and still meet the chronic standard. And you can see that cadmium, zinc, copper, and lead do not meet the chronic exceedances allowed. There's more exceedances that occur, but almost all of those exceedances for cadmium, copper, and lead, almost all of them are during spring runoff, April to May. And the rest of the year, there's virtually none. So this is a way of looking at whether or not you're attaining standards in this section of Mineral Creek. So the CAG's proposal is to add an aquatic life use classification and standards protective of the use. The table value standards would be applied, but there'd be an acknowledgement that table value standards are not attainable during spring runoff for cadmium, copper, lead, and zinc. Also, that table values or standards are also likely not to be obtained for zinc the rest of the year. And the CAG provided extensive data showing that only a small portion of these exceedances, especially during spring runoff, can be attributed directly to mine sites. There's been an awful lot of work in this area in cleaning up and remediating mine sites. And honestly, we don't feel like there's a whole lot more that can be done that'll really make much more of an improvement in this particular stretch. The reason, let me back up for a second, the reason that that stretch ends at where it does, the bottom of segment 4 there, is that tributary coming in on the left-hand side at the bottom of that segment 4 is the middle fork of Mineral Creek. And that is loaded with iron and aluminum, virtually all natural iron and aluminum. And it wipes out aquatic life pretty much between segment 4 and segment 3. And there's really very little that anyone's going to be able to do about it. It also lowers the pH. In the wintertime, the pH is very low in that segment. So what we put in our kind of a summary of our pre-hearing statement, and I'll back up for a second here. This hearing process started in February. The CAG filed a pre-hearing statement at the beginning of March. And then there's something called responsive pre-hearing statements from other parties will be are due in 2 days on Wednesday. We've certainly been having conversations with the Water Quality Control Division, EPA, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, some other parties as well about this proposal. Then there'll be a chance for rebuttal statements at the beginning of May, and the actual hearing will occur in early June. So in our pre-hearing statement, what we pointed out was what I said before, that TVS is not met during spring runoff, and that you really need reductions for cadmium and copper. You need about a 60% reduction in cadmium and copper to meet table value standards, and about a 70% reduction in lead and zinc to meet chronic table value standards during spring runoff. And we just feel you're just not going to get there. From the information that we have, a lot of it's samples from the EPA, some samples from the CAG, some older historical samples, is that during runoff, mine sites appear to only contribute about 10% of the zinc, cadmium, and copper, and 33% of the lead. So the reductions just aren't there to meet table value standards. During the rest of the year, you need about a 33% reduction in zinc to meet chronic table value standards. Mine sites do contribute or appear to contribute more than 33%, but there's a question as to how much reduction you can really make at these mine sites. The two biggest sources of metals are the silver ledge in the coal mines, the draining mines there. They're very difficult sites to work on. It's kind of difficult to think about what else you could do with the coal. We've already made enormous reductions there, and whether you could make much more reductions is kind of hard to figure out. And the silver ledge is a very difficult site to work at where the draining adit is. So we're not sure how much more reductions we can get. So anyway, in our pre-hearing statement, we said that site-specific standards are appropriate for the 4 metals during runoff and likely appropriate for the rest of the year for zinc. So, and with that, I think I've kind of spouted off quite a bit there pretty quickly, and I'm going to give my voice a rest. And Anthony is going to talk about the two settlement agreements that are in the process of moving forward. Anthony?
Yeah, I changed a couple things, Peter. Do you
Okay.
wanna do you mind if can you unshare and let me share, or maybe Carolyn can help us out there?
Sure, I can do that. Okay. Now you should be able to share.
Okay, just a second. Just give me a second here. Well, can you see that at this point? I can't hear you, Peter.
We can see your slides.
Yeah,
Okay.
we can see them.
Okay.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay. So thanks, Peter. So in regards to the settlement agreements, there have been two. The first, I think, was released in December. That was the natural resources damages settlement. And that was between the state of Colorado and Sunnyside Gold. And then the second settlement, the larger settlements, the BPMD Superfund settlement between the primary potential responsible parties. And I say primary because these were the, I would just say, heavy hitters. That's not a term of art or a legal term. The word primary isn't, but so in regards to the natural resource damages settlement, that was between the state of Colorado and Sunnyside. That was ultimately determined in the District Court of New Mexico. When it first came out, it did have the District Court in Colorado, U.S. District. The settlement amount in that was $1.2 million to settle the state's natural resource damages resulting from the Gold King release, and then an additional $400,000 to settle the state's claims for damages from other releases within the site over the period. So that was 1.6. And so those are the monies that are going for Colorado's natural resources damages to the state. Just to be clear, the settlement announced, the Attorney General Phil Weiser had announced that it's a step in the right direction. And then at the end, you can see that the trustees, and that'd be the trustees for the state of Colorado, will be partnering with the local community on how to invest those funds. The settlement that most people were more interested in and commenting on, well, actually, let me just stop there. On the state settlement, that was lodged in the court in February, and it was approved by the judge. There wasn't a lot of comment, if any, opposing the natural resource damages settlement. So that settlement is already been ordered and approved by the court. So there's not a lot more to be done other than the transfer of funds and then the investment in the watershed. In regards to the BPMD Superfund settlement, those parties were included Sunnyside Gold, and Ken Ross and all of their the affiliates there, but then the federal land management agencies, that'd be the BLM and the Forest Service and the EPA. That too was in U.S. District Court of New Mexico in the multi-district litigation. And that settlement requires that $40 million be paid by Sunnyside to the United States, and that they'll pay Colorado $4 million, and then that the United States, on behalf of the settling federal agencies, again, that's the BLM, Forest Service, and EPA, make payment in the amount of $45 million to the appropriate federal accounts. It's been a lot of inquiry as to how we know how much it's going to cost and why are we settling early before we know what the remedy is going to be. Well, that's just how it works. There was a lot of thought that went into the cost of litigation would be astronomical in this matter because of numerous reasons, and that this was a way to move forward. So the current status, both of these settlements went under comment, request for comment, and current status is that those comments are under review by the DOJ. Once the DOJ is ready to lodge those comments, they will do so and request, and the settlement agreement, the consent decree, if you will have to withstand intervention if there's any entity that intervenes and be approved. To give you an idea, I mean, the CAG, Peter, I don't know if you could, I know the CAG had some comments. The local community, one of the comments was requesting that the DOJ go back to the Treasury and ask for funds for some of the assurances that were made to the local community. The CAG also made some requests, and those are available if anybody is interested in those. But one of them that may be of interest is that the downstream businesses that experience losses would be compensated for those losses during that time. So the anticipated distribution of the Superfund settlement, this is separate than the natural resource damages settlement, is that the Colorado would receive $4,050,000, and the majority of the remaining settlement funds would be dispersed to the EPA. This is an approximation. This is not from the agency directly. Let me just clarify that. We're assuming that it'll be around 70 to 80 million just based upon the ratio of area that they're responsible for versus the federal agencies directly. And in regards to that, the EPA has made it clear to date that those monies would be invested in the watershed, in the Superfund site, and they would not be backfilling any funds already spent. And in regards to the remainder, which could be 5 to 10 million, I would assume, of funds, those would go to the federal land management agencies. To my knowledge, the federal land management agencies to date have not been able to identify whether or not they would, or they haven't identified whether or not they would invest those in the watershed or whether they would be somewhere else in their program. And so that's it on the Superfund site. I'll stop share now. And are there questions for Peter and I concerning his presentation earlier, or the settlements, or where they are right now?
Feel free to raise your hand if you'd like, or unmute yourself and ask a question.
I'll also note that in the CAG's comments on the Sunnyside settlement agreement, one of the biggest concerns to CAG was that the monies going to the federal land management agencies would not necessarily be spent in the basin. They indicated to us that they may go, particularly BLM, that it may go to a central hazardous fund, and that money could then be applied. People could, different regions could apply for that money, and that money might go elsewhere in the United States. And we just felt like, hey, this is a settlement of liabilities, and liabilities associated with land management agencies, and that money ought to be spent in this basin.
Yeah. Thanks, Peter. One of the other things, Peter mentioned earlier on that tailings pond being one of the larger flat areas inside San Juan County, and it is. There are some other areas that we anticipate that Sunnyside will be relinquishing during the process of wrapping up their Superfund liability here. And in San Juan County, Colorado requested that those lands be transferred to the town and the county so they could remain in with the government and potentially private again. But the idea is that if they would not be, those lands were put into a federal land management agency, we'd be very limited on how we could maybe expand our community in the future.
Well, I have a quick question, Anthony. Would this settlement agreement be the end of Sunnyside Gold's responsibility for damage payments, or would there be other settlements that would be coming down the pike?
Well, there is the potential for other PRPs, depending on how the future goes, requesting or intervening, so to speak. But the Superfund, Sunnyside would be relieved from their duty and to the EPA or the state inside the Superfund. It can get a little more complex. It'll depend on what actions the EPA takes in the future. And I don't even know if the agency can tell you what they'll do 10 years from now or 15 years from now. But it seems that this is probably, I mean, they're done with the Superfund at this point.
Okay. And so all of this, all the funding would then go to the EPA funding would go to the Superfund site itself to remediation.
Yeah, it's important to remember, Christine and everyone, that there's still, I don't know if all the lawsuits, I think the one with Utah has been settled, and I'm not sure with New Mexico, but this is separate from independent lawsuits that are non-Superfund related. Peter, you were going to say something too.
I was just going to note that since the Superfund designation, Sunnyside says they spent about $14 million or so doing mostly site characterization around those tailings ponds, drilling a lot of holes, doing a lot of sampling, drilling a lot of holes between the tailings ponds and the rivers. Their feeling is, yeah, we've put together a lot of information and we're done. We're passing all this investigative work now on to EPA. Although they will, I think, maintain ownership of these tailings ponds, even though the repository is on top. And I don't know down the road how ownership might change.
Any other questions? Well, I have a few more.
Sure.
So Peter, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the aquatic life use classification. Was that not put into place in that portion of Mineral Creek simply because it was so contaminated that there was no way that aquatic life could exist there? And now with the remediation, it's a possibility, and sounds like there's some healthy populations there. And my second question is, if at the bottom of segment 4, it's the tributary coming in from the middle fork, Mineral Creek, so that section would be kind of a dead zone. How will there be any sort of connectivity between section 3 and section 4 with that space in between where there's so much natural metals contamination that it's not possible for aquatic life to survive?
The answer to your first question is that's exactly right, that there was much too high metal concentrations in that segment of 4. And that's why it doesn't have an aquatic life use. And now there is aquatic life. So clearly it needs to have that use classification. In terms of conductivity, possibly during spring runoff or the summer months, maybe the water quality might be good enough that fish would move back and forth. And of course, standards are based upon generally when the most sensitive time period for fish, and that tends to be the beginning stages of their lives. And so when they're a little bigger, they might be able to tolerate the metals a little better, and they might be able to actually pass through that area. But it's pretty poor water quality in that particular segment. They're not going to spend a lot of time there. And really, once you get below the South Fork of Mineral Creek, the South Fork of Mineral Creek has fairly good water quality and a pretty good brook trout fishery. But between that and the Animas River, it only has fairly good quality during the summer months. And we don't think there's any kind of established populations of brook trout in that particular section, nor do we expect there will be in the future either. It's really, there's just not, there are some things that could be done to improve things in Mineral Creek, but I don't think they're very dramatic at this point.
Sounds like most of the improvements have already been made.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and everyone, when people first had money, everyone went for the low-hanging fruit. And so a lot of the easier stuff has been done throughout the basin, and it's kind of the harder stuff that you have to get after now, the more expensive stuff.
What was the number of projects that the Animas River Stakeholders Group with partners did, Peter?
Yeah, before the Superfund designation, there were about 60 mine remediation projects that were done in the upper basin. And quite a few of those were done by Sunnyside Gold in their consent decree to offset potential increases in metal loading because of the bulkheads they put in. But that was still less than, I think mining companies accounted for a little less than half of those 60 projects. A little more than a quarter were accounted for by the Animas River Stakeholders Group, and a little less than a quarter were accounted for by the land management agencies, BLM and Forest Service.
If you had to pick the next hard project, what would you say that would be?
Well, we've been pushing for quite a while for the bulkhead to be shut at the Red and Bonita. That would have an immediate impact. That it would have a measurable impact downstream below Silverton. I think EPA's concern is what might happen underground with the water. It certainly could get pushed up to the Gold King. You might see some more discharge coming out of the Gold King with that bulkhead shut. There's a couple other mines that you might see a little discharge out of. But I think our sense is if you don't shut it and leave it shut for a while, you won't know until you actually test it and see where it comes out. And that would be the next step that you could make a significant difference. Either that or actually treating the Red and Bonita at the treatment plant. There is a pipeline between the Red and Bonita and the treatment plant. But EPA's position is that treatment plant is just for the Gold King, and they have not treated the Red. They're not willing to commit to long-term treatment of the Red and Bonita.
Well, that kind of brings me to my next question. How much is known about the hydrology underneath these extensive mine workings, or is it still a big question mark?
I think it's a big question mark. I'm not sure whether you're ever going to know. There's a lot of fracture zones. I really think it's going to be a little bit of an adaptive management issue where you have to shut a bulkhead and try another bulkhead and kind of see what happens. I think all the modeling that you do, it's hard for me to imagine that the modeling is going to be all that accurate. I think you're really going to have to just test it.
Which is one of the challenges, right?
Yes.
So I've been monopolizing the questions. Are there any other questions people have? Okay, I'm going to monopolize it more. The Lake Emma story was really fascinating because I did not know about that it basically imploded. Can you tell a little bit more about how that happened? It sounds really interesting and a little bizarre.
Sure. The Sunnyside mine worked up underneath Lake Emma. I think some people feel that there might have been glacial ice under Lake Emma that was kind of holding the ground together, and that the mine heated it up and melted some of that ice, and that's why it crashed through. It was very fortunate that it happened on a Sunday, because the miners didn't work on Sundays and nobody was in the mine, because anybody in the mine would have been killed. It did flush out a lot of material there at the American Tunnel. There was a watchman there kind of at the buildings that saw it come flying out. It did turn the Animas River pretty much black. It did kill fish, I think, all the way down to Farmington. And you had an earlier presentation about sediments in Lake Powell, and they discovered that there were some high metal levels in the 1970s.
Right.
Could very well have been from Lake Emma. There was also tailings pond number, I think it was number 1, collapsed and released in about 74, and also sent a lot of material down the river. So that might have been an event that made a difference at Lake Powell too, but probably it might have been Lake Emma. It took Sunnyside 2 years to rehabilitate the mine and be able to start production again. We have a CAG member who was working in the mine 2 days before it happened, and said that they had already closed off part of the mine because there was so much water and rocks coming off the ceiling in that particular space. And he went off on a river trip and came back from a river trip and found out what had happened.
So you said 2 years. Was there discharge to the American Tunnel during all that 2 years?
I'm sure there was
just an immediate. The immediate release was obviously the big concern, but then after that.
Well, and before the release, there was no treatment. There was no treatment plant.
Okay.
Treatment plant didn't come in until the late 1970s. So it might have happened. Maybe the treatment plant was a rudimentary treatment plant was put there right around 78. But yeah, there was just a release coming out of the American Tunnel for years and years. And it probably, I think on average, it may have been somewhere around 1,200 gallons per minute, but at times a year, it might be 3,000 gallons per minute. And it was an enormous source of metals, much larger than any sources that we have around up there today.
Okay. It's interesting historical perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else either of you would like to add before we close out the presentation today?
I think we're good if nobody has any questions. Peter?
No, I don't think I have anything more.
Okay, great. Thank you both so much for the update. It was totally fascinating. I learned a lot today. And well, first, thank you, Peter and Anthony, for presenting today. Really appreciate you coming. And also would like to let everybody know 2 weeks, our next Lunch and Learn is going to be the Farmington Coring Project. So we've seen Lake Powell coring. We're going to talk a little bit with Joanna Blake and Jeb Brown from USGS about the Farmington Coring Project. So hope to see all of you in 2 weeks, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having us.